I remember the exact weight of the silence that followed. Not the words, the silence after them. He had said it the way powerful men say things they believe, without hesitation, without cruelty, without even the decency of looking away. He stood at the center of the room that had been built on everything I had given him, and he said it as though it were simply true. I don't need you. 4 words. I had translated dispatches from 3 languages. I had read meaning into the spaces between sentences that trained diplomats had missed entirely. I had spent 2 years learning the precise architecture of his silences. Which ones were thought, which ones were grief, which ones were the shape of something he could not yet bring himself to say. And so I understood, with absolute clarity, what those 4 words were. They were not the truth. They were the door he was opening for me. I looked at him for a long moment. Long enough to let him hear what he had just said. Long enough to decide, not whether I would answer, but how. I had refused men before. I had done it quietly, completely, without the trembling that men expected and some secretly required. I had learned early that the most devastating thing a woman can do when a man underestimates her is to simply agree with him. So I agreed with him. Good, I said. 1 word. His face did something then. Something small, something that lasted less than a breath. I filed it away. I had always been meticulous about filing things away. I gathered what was mine, not quickly, not with the shaking hands of a woman who has just been broken. I moved with the same precision I brought to everything, each motion deliberate, each step a sentence in a language he was only beginning to understand, he had never learned to read. I walked to the door. I did not look back. Not because I was not tempted. I was. God help me, I was. But I had learned, through years of reading what was not written, of hearing what was not spoken, that the most powerful thing in any room is not the person who speaks last. It is the person who refuses to turn around. I stepped through the door, and somewhere behind me, in the silence of a room that suddenly had too much space in it, the Duke of Ashford stood very still and watched me go. I should tell you how I came to be in that room. Not the version that circulated through the corridors of the castle, the one whispered between ladies who had too much time and too little imagination. That version was simple, convenient, a woman of modest means, given shelter by a powerful man. A transaction dressed in propriety. The truth was less tidy. My father had been a scholar, not a wealthy one, scholars rarely are, but a precise one. A man who believed that language was not merely a tool of thought, but a tool of power. He kept a leather journal beside every book he read, and in it he wrote not summaries, but questions. The things the author had not said, the places where a careful mind had chosen, deliberately, to look away. He gave me the 6th journal when I was 9. Write what is not written, he said. That is where the truth lives. I had been doing it ever since. I was 26 when I arrived at Ashford Castle, a Thursday in February. The kind of cold that simply occupies everything. The stones, the corridors, the faces of the staff who received me with the careful neutrality of people who had learned not to form opinions about arrivals until they understood whether the arrival was permanent. My name was Clara Wentworth, and I had learned long before arriving at Ashford Castle that a woman's name means very little until she gives it weight herself. The Duke read the letter standing at his desk. He did not sit. He did not offer me a chair. He read it once, folded it with the precision of a man who folded everything exactly once, and set it to the left side of the desk where, I would later learn, he placed things that required action rather than consideration. Then he handed me a document from the right side, the side for things already decided, a trade agreement, written in German, dense with the particular opacity that men use when they want something to appear more complicated than it is. Tell me what this actually says, he said. Not what it says, what it actually says. There was a clause in the 3rd paragraph, buried inside a subordinate sentence about shipping routes that transferred mineral inspection rights quietly and permanently to the other party. It was written to be missed. I did not miss it. The 3rd paragraph, the shipping clause. It is not about shipping. It is about the Keswick mines. In 18 months, he will have grounds to contest your extraction license. You will have signed the document that gave them to him. He absorbed it the way old stone absorbed cold. When he spoke again, his voice was exactly the same as it had been before. You read the gap, he said. Yes. Can you do it consistently? I have never been unable to. He looked at me the way he had looked at the document, as something that required his full attention. Monday, he said. 7 o'clock. I was there at 6:55. I had been reading him ever since. 2 years is long enough to learn a person. Not the version they present to the world. That takes only weeks. The version beneath it. The one that surfaces at 6 in the morning before the performance has begun. Or at 11 at night when the performance has exhausted itself and there is nothing left but the truth of a man sitting alone in a room he has filled with work so that he does not have to notice it is empty. I learned Edmund Ashford in the gaps. He wound the clock on the study mantel every morning at precisely 7. Not because he distrusted the mechanism, the clock was Swiss, accurate to within 4 seconds a week, but because the winding was the one moment of the day in which he permitted himself to be entirely still. 30 seconds, both hands occupied. Nothing else required of him. I understood, watching him do it for the 419th time, that it was the closest thing he had to prayer. He took his coffee without speaking for the first 20 minutes of every morning. Not from rudeness. Those 20 minutes were the last ones that belonged entirely to him before the day began to take pieces, and he guarded them with the quiet ferocity of a man who has learned that no one will guard them for him. When he disagreed with something he found deeply wrong, not merely inconvenient, but wrong in the way that touched something he considered essential, he did not argue. He went very quiet. His left hand closed once, briefly, at his side, and then opened again, as if he were releasing something he had decided not to say. I had catalogued 43 instances of that gesture in 2 years. I had never told him. I learned also that he had not slept well in a long time. The study was directly below my room, and the floors of the castle were old stone, thick, cold, the kind that carries sound sideways rather than up, so that what I heard was not footsteps exactly, but the particular silence that follows them. The pacing that began near midnight, the long stillnesses that were not sleep, but something adjacent to it. A man standing at a window, looking at something the darkness had long since swallowed. The sound once of a glass set down without being drunk from. I never asked him about it. He never offered. That was the architecture of what we were, precise, functional, carefully bounded by the distance that propriety required, and that we had both agreed, without ever discussing the agreement, to maintain, not because we did not feel the weight of it, but because naming it would have changed everything, and neither of us was certain the change would be survivable. But there were moments that strained the architecture. A Wednesday in March, a letter arrived that I could identify from across the room as painful, not from its contents, which I did not read, but from the way he set it down, flat, both hands, the way you set down something you need to stop holding. He stood at the window for 11 minutes. I counted. I continued my work. Neither of us spoke, and both of us understood that my remaining in the room was the only form of comfort either of us was permitted to offer or receive. And then there was the evening in October when he laughed, not the version he deployed at dinners, the controlled, socially functional approximation that satisfied the expectation of warmth without actually producing it, the real one, sudden, unguarded, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, in response to something I had said about the syntactical cowardice of a French ambassador's latest communiqué. He recovered immediately, but for those 3 or 4 seconds, every careful boundary in the room had ceased to exist. I did not smile. I did not acknowledge it. I picked up my pen and continued the sentence I had been writing, but I felt the weight of those seconds for a week. That was when I understood, with the same precision I brought to everything, that what was happening between us was not nothing, that it had a name, that the name was growing larger than the silence we had built to contain it, and that neither of us was going to say it first, because saying it would have required one of us to risk something the other might not be ready to receive. And we were both, I think, too careful for that. Or perhaps, and this is the thing I have only admitted to myself much later, in the particular honesty that comes with distance, we were both simply afraid. His name was Lord Cavendish, and he arrived at Ashford Castle on a Tuesday morning in November with the easy confidence of a man who has never been refused anything that mattered to him, which is a particular kind of confidence, I had learned, because it has never been tested. It is not strength. It is simply the absence of adversity dressed in expensive wool. He came on behalf of the Northern Trading Coalition, a consortium of landowners and merchants who had spent 3 years attempting to acquire the mineral rights to the Ashford Valley. The Duke had refused them twice, in terms that left very little room for interpretation. Cavendish believed the third attempt would be different. He believed this because someone had told him something about the Duke that someone should not have known, not about the mineral rights, about me. I understood it within the first hour of his arrival, from the particular way he looked at me at dinner, not with the usual calculation men applied to women in my position. Something more specific. He was measuring something he believed he already knew the answer to. He confirmed it the following morning. Through the study door he had not known was imperfectly closed. Your arrangement with the translator, Ashford, it is understood in certain circles. He was not threatening the Duke's reputation. He was threatening mine, and he was using it as leverage because someone had told him that the fastest way through Edmund Ashford's defenses was not through his ambitions. It was through me. I stepped back from the door. I returned to my desk, and I began to work. Not on the correspondence in front of me, on Cavendish. I had spent 2 years reading documents for what they concealed rather than what they declared. I applied the same method now to a man. I wrote 3 letters that afternoon, not under my name, under the names of correspondents I had cultivated across 2 years of diplomatic translation work. One to a solicitor in Edinburgh who handled land registry disputes, one to a clerk in the Parliamentary Records Office in London, one to a woman in Newcastle who had been, before her marriage, the personal secretary of the coalition's founding member. I asked each of them a single specific question. The replies arrived within the week. They were individually unremarkable. Together, they were a document. The coalition's mineral survey, the one Cavendish had presented to 3 separate landowners as independent verification of the valley's value, had been written by a single geologist. The same geologist had signed all 3 surveys under different names. The valuations were fabricated. The coalition had been acquiring rights to land worth a fraction of what they had claimed, from families who had trusted numbers they had no means to verify. I copied the relevant passages in my clearest hand. I left the document on the Duke's desk that evening, beneath his correspondence, where he would find it before Cavendish came to breakfast. I said nothing. I did not need to. He came to me that evening, not with the measured knock he always used, the one that gave me time to compose myself, to become again the precise and unreadable woman he had hired 2 years ago. He came with the door already open, and the look on his face that I had learned to recognize as the one he wore when he had made a decision he did not yet know how to say. I set down my pen. I waited. "Cavendish has made his position clear," he said. "I heard him," I said. I was in the corridor. He looked at me. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like the recognition that I had, once again, known something before he had arranged himself to tell me. "Then you understand the situation." "I understand that he believes I am a liability to you," I said, "and I understand that he is wrong about almost everything except that." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had come up over the valley, and I could hear it moving through the stones of the castle the way sound always moved through old things, slowly, carrying more than it meant to. "I have been thinking," he said, "about a solution. And here is the thing I have never told anyone. The thing I have turned over in the years since, examining it from every angle the way I examined difficult translations, looking for the place where intention diverged from language. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. I knew it from the particular way he was standing. The left hand closed briefly at his side, then opened. The thing he did when he was releasing something he had decided not to say. Except this time, he was releasing something he had decided he must say. Something he believed was the responsible choice, the honorable choice. The choice that protected me by removing me from the equation entirely. He was going to offer to let me go, and he was going to frame it as the solution. "I don't need you," he said, "to remain in this position. The work is largely complete. The arrangement has served its purpose. It would be reasonable for you to consider other opportunities. I would provide letters of introduction, sufficient funds for—" I stopped hearing the rest. Not because it hurt. It did hurt, with the specific, clean pain of a thing you have braced for and been struck by anyway. But I stopped hearing it because I was already thinking with the part of my mind that never stopped working, never stopped translating, never stopped reading the gap between what was said and what was meant. I had spent 26 years becoming Clara Wentworth, precise, unreadable, indispensable, and he had just told me in 4 words that none of it was necessary, and what he meant was the opposite. I knew it with absolute certainty. He was not releasing me because he didn't need me. He was releasing me because he did. Because keeping me was costing him something he had decided I should not have to pay for. Because Lord Cavendish had found the one lever that moved Edmund Ashford, and Edmund Ashford was trying to remove the lever by removing me. It was, in its way, the most eloquent thing he had ever said to me, and I was not going to let him say it. "Good," I said. He stopped. "I beg your pardon?" "Good," I said again, quietly, completely, with the same finality I had always brought to things I had decided. "Then this is straightforward." I rose from my chair. I did not look at his face, not because I was afraid of what I would find there, but because I knew exactly what I would find, and I needed to be able to walk through the door anyway. I walked through the door. I did not look back. I have been asked, in the years since, what it felt like. To walk out of that room, to cross the courtyard in the cold November dark, with nothing but my trunk and the particular silence of a woman who has just done the hardest thing she has ever done and is not yet certain she will survive it. I tell people it felt like clarity. That is true. But it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I walked the length of the south corridor, counting my steps, because if I stopped counting, I would stop walking. The whole truth is that I sat in my room that night with my hands folded in my lap and my eyes open and did not sleep, not once, because sleep required a loosening I could not afford. The whole truth is that I packed my trunk with the same deliberate precision I brought to everything, folding each item as if the neatness of it mattered, as if the careful arrangement of small things could substitute for the careful arrangement of larger ones that had just come apart. I was gone before dawn. I did not tell him I was leaving. I had said what I had to say. The rest was motion. What I learned afterward came to me in pieces, from sources I had not expected. The housekeeper, who wrote to me 3 weeks later, with the barely contained urgency of a woman who had witnessed something she needed someone else to understand. A former colleague who had heard things from people who had been at the castle the morning after I left. And eventually, much later, from Edmund himself. He had not slept. Not the restless pacing insomnia I had learned to read through the floors. This was something different. This was a man sitting in a chair behind his desk from midnight until dawn, completely still, with the door to my empty office open in front of him, not moving because, as he told me later in the particular plain language he had learned by then to use with me, there was nowhere in the castle worth going. At some point in the night he had walked into my office. The desk was clear. The chair was empty. The inkwell, which I had sealed carefully before I left, sat in the center of the desk with the precision I always brought to small things. He had stood there for a long time. Then he had picked up the inkwell, turned it over in his hands, set it back down. At 5 a.m, Mrs. Holt found him at the window of the study, watching the road that led away from the castle. The sky was the gray of early winter dawn. The valley was empty. He had been standing there, she told me, for 2 hours, still watching the road, as if he believed, or perhaps only hoped, that the road might eventually give back what it had taken. He came for me on the 3rd day, not with a letter, not with an intermediary, not with the careful, managed approach of a man who has arranged things in advance so that the outcome is already certain before the asking begins. He came himself, on horseback, in the rain. My sister Jane had not asked me why I came. She had simply opened the door, taken my trunk, and put the kettle on. That was Jane. He stood at the door of my sister's house with his hat in his hand and water running down the lines of his face, and he looked at me the way he had looked at that first document, as something that required his complete attention, and he said, "I lied to you. Not, I was mistaken. Not, I may have spoken poorly. Not the elegant, qualified half-admission of a man who wants credit for honesty without paying its full price. I lied. The sentence I said to you was the opposite of the true one. I am saying the true one now. I need you. I have needed you for longer than I knew how to admit, and I am asking you to come back." He paused. Then, for the first time in 2 years, he said my name. Not my title, not Mrs. Wentworth, just Clara. As if he had been holding it in his mouth the entire time and had only now decided it was safe to release. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough to let him stand in the rain a little longer. Not from cruelty, from precision, because some moments require their full weight before you answer them. Then I said, "If I come back, Edmund, you will say the thing, not the permitted version of it, not the cold approximation of it, the thing itself, every time, even when it costs you, even when you cannot find the words for it immediately. You will tell me you cannot find them, and I will wait, but I will not wait for the wrong sentence again." He held my gaze. "Agreed," he said. One word. The same weight mine had carried 3 days before. I stepped back from the door and let him in. I have thought often, in the years since, about what that story actually teaches. Not the romance of it, the architecture of it. Your silence is not weakness, it is information. There are people in this world who will only understand your value at the precise moment they are forced to calculate your absence. You cannot teach that lesson with words. You can only teach it by leaving. And the hardest part, the part no one tells you, is that leaving is not the end of the story. It is the moment the real story begins. Sometimes the man standing in the rain is finally saying the true sentence, but you decide the terms of the return, always. Know your worth before the room goes quiet, because the woman who knows it never has to demand it. She simply leaves and lets the silence do the rest.